Friends, this is a punched card. It's made out of paper, and it's one of the dumbest forms of computer storage that has ever been out there. Want to know more? Welcome to the Middle-Aged Hack Channel. I am Stuart. I am your middle-aged hack, just a child of the 80s trying to make his way through the 20s, and I hope you'll take the journey with me. Today, we're talking about punch cards. And punch cards were a form of storage that were very, very common in computers up until the mid-1970s. They have an interesting history that predates computers, and even though, as I said, they're one of the dumbest forms of computer storage, they were also a way that computers became part of our everyday lives. The story of how they were invented and how they were first used is a big part of how computers really came to be what they are today. The punched card itself is just a rectangular piece of paper, and it's got rectangular holes punched in it in specific places. Now, most punch cards used for computers used one of 2 or 3 unique codes. And this one, I'm not quite sure which code it uses, or even if it's properly coded at all. The punch card itself is a little bit bigger than a dollar bill, and that wasn't always true. When the punch card itself was invented, it was exactly the same size as a dollar bill, and if you used to get savings bonds, and you notice those had little punch holes in them too, they're the same size as savings bonds. I don't quite know why dollar bills got smaller, but punch cards didn't. The history of punch cards goes all the way back to the 18th century, 1725 in fact. We're talking about the late Renaissance era, the era before real manufacturing, but when people were starting to want the better things in life that only rich people were able to afford. And there was a big push to try to find a way to make things that really, anybody could afford, but still they looked good. Everybody loved Oriental rugs and tapestries and stuff like that, but those were incredibly expensive to make because it took somebody who had just this huge presence of mind to do it, and it was very, very slow. Well, the first punch cards were actually used to automate the making of those kinds of rugs. I found this one picture, which seems to be the one picture that's on every website, and it shows you how a chain made up of these little punched plaques was able to control a loom. Now, a lot of it was still very human generated because remember, this was before electricity, this was before the Industrial Revolution. But at least at that point, the machine remembered what it needed to do next, and the human just needed to provide the motion power to do it. Punch cards kind of stayed in that configuration for about another 150 years, and they weren't known to too many people. The next step in the evolution of punch cards comes in the 1880s. Interestingly enough, my video has not been able to pin down exactly what year in the 1880s, but it was sometime. You have to think about this time when America was growing and the need for information was there and everything was new and there was, that feeling in the air like anything was possible. And, it was possible for the first time to automate so many tasks. And the country had grown so big in such a short period of time. Remember, the Constitution in the US requires that a census be taken every 10 years. But with the 1880 census, well, the government realized they really had gotten to the point that they couldn't do it. They figured out that maybe doing the 1890 census the way they were doing it was going to take longer than 10 years to count. So this one guy whose name was Herman Hollerith had an idea. And here's the funny thing about Herman Hollerith. I mean, he's got this kind of dignified sounding name. Herman Hollerith was in his mid-20s. He was what we consider today kind of a slacker, but he had an idea. And that idea was to automate the counting of the census by recording information on punched cards. As I said, he chose the size of a dollar bill as the reference for his card, and he created a system where you could represent every letter and every number and a couple of punctuation marks all on this one card. We call that the Hollerith code today, and nobody really much uses it, but it was an incredibly important part of what was going on. The government of the United States thought this was a great idea, and they bought into this. They bought tons and tons and tons of punch cards and the machines to make them and the machines to read them. And it meant that the 1890 census was done faster than any other census before. Now, it really still wasn't exactly tabulated by computer. In these days, computers were, really just, there was no actual computing. The idea of even a mechanical computer was pretty much science fiction until about 50 years later. But at least these cards would help increment certain things, certain bits of data, so that the counting process could be a lot faster. Herman Hollerith got rich very quickly from this, and he formed a company that later changed its name to International Business Machines. You know him as IBM. And while IBM isn't a huge part of life today, they were a huge, huge part of the history of computers, and they pretty much dominated most of computing in the 20th century. Matter of fact, it got so powerful at one point, IBM became so powerful, and their fates were so closely tied to the punch card system that the government had to intervene and make sure that IBM only had half of the market for punch cards in the world. They limited them to half of it, which was still a gigantic number. I said before that this was one of the stupidest forms of storage, and it is. It's not the stupidest form of storage ever was paper tape, and I might do a video on that some other day. But you see, each punch card could only represent one line. So 80 characters. So just imagine, so if you were making something and you were creating one typed page, well, you might just have a stack of 60 of these things just for that one page. So imagine if you were doing a book, you might have thousands. And more importantly, if you were writing a program with thousands of lines, you would have thousands of cards. They all were punched individually, and the way that most people did it was they loaded a stack of cards in and they typed it manually, and the machine would punch the card with those right holes. And generally, if you were lucky and had a great system to do it, they would also dot matrix print what you had typed on the top, so you didn't have to manually decode it. It would also print a card number, but these cards weren't automatically incremented. It's not like you could take a look at one and see where in the batch it falls just by, kind of having some sort of notch on it, which meant that if you dropped a stack of punch cards, it was going to take you the rest of the day to put them back in order. If they got creased, they didn't work. If they got wet, they didn't work. If they got old, they didn't work. Why? Because the way that the holes worked were actually individual metal fingers went through those holes to sense what was going on. And if the metal fingers went through those holes too many times, they would just rip. If there were too many holes in a card, it would just rip. This was a really tough way to store stuff, but it was the way that we had. And it was better than nothing, I suppose. Punch cards were pretty much the only game in town until the mid-1950s when magnetic tape came around. Magnetic tape also had its problems, like, you couldn't be around it with magnets and it would still stretch and break, stuff like that. But it was a lot better than paper, and that's the important stuff. Magnetic tape started to take over, and even IBM recognized magnetic tape was the future, and they started including it in their computers in the 1960s. By the mid-1970s, there were a bunch of different options for storage, magnetic tape only being one of them. You had the very early floppy disks, which were, no kidding, 8 inches in size. They were this big. You had disk packs and disk cartridges, which were 13 and 14 inches in diameter and weighed 10 to 20 pounds, went into a disk drive the size of a washing machine. But all of these things were better than punch cards. punch cards started to fade into the background because honestly, by the 1970s, nobody wanted them. The legacy of punch cards, though, is still with us. The code that is used for representing characters on every computer and every phone that's out there is a descendant of the Hollerith code. The way that everything is tabulated today and stored owes its very life to the way that those standard punch cards were stored. And there, I'm sure, are still programs out there that are only accessible on punched cards. And who knows, if we had another Y2K situation, if we needed to reload those punch cards, I don't know what we would do. As far as I know, there's only one place in the country that has a punch card maker and a punch card reader, and that's the Computer History Museum, which is in Mountain View, California. I've been there, and that's where I got that particular punch card that I keep showing you. If you like computer history, I really recommend that you go there. That's it for the Middle-Aged Hack for today. I hope that you like and subscribe, help me build this channel up to the point where I can monetize it, because honestly, I enjoy doing this an awful lot, but I would also enjoy a little bit of income. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you again next time.